Turn on your mechanical translator.
Sure, of course. I've got them right here.
My guess is, sir, that they use microwaves for what you might call person-to-person conversation.
The basic idea is that there's a groove that I can follow that's exactly right for me to live in an optimum way.
Truth.
And soul!
Truth and Soul Incorporated, the New Zealand advertising podcast.
Hello and welcome. Today's chat will be a little different. I'm talking to Mark Kilgour and Hugh O'Connor, who are from the University of Waikato. Now, don't run off screaming. They've spent many years researching creativity in advertising, so we hope to learn what it is that we're doing wrong, how we can do it better, and whether academics can actually make themselves understood to the rest of the population. We talk about creativity, what it actually is, and whether or not anyone can be creative or if you need it in your genes. So, if you never went to university, get yourself a case of cheap beer, set fire to the sofa, and find out what you missed out on. You'll be amazed, hopefully. We're going to split this podcast into two because the guys covered a lot of interesting subjects and it's quite in depth and it's quite a rich chat. So here is episode 1. Welcome back to the Truth and Soul New Zealand advertising podcast. Today in the Franklin Road studios in deepest Freeman's Bay, we have Hugh and Mark from the University of Waikato. Now, this is a bit of a change from the normal sad old advertising guests that we have, but these gentlemen have been looking into maybe the science behind creativity, if there is such a thing. Well, I'll let them get more into that. And so, how exactly did you get interested in advertising creativity and the science behind that?
Thank you, Paul. I started looking at this.
So this is Mark, by the way.
Yeah. I started looking at this probably the late 1990s. I was in Singapore at the time. I was doing some consultancy work there, but also doing some research and looking to do a PhD. In Singapore, if you know Singapore at all, it's a very structured environment. Yep. The kids from about 6 years old are doing a whole lot of extra tuition, very much that sort of rigid learning type environment. They were really interested in creativity, however. They didn't want to...
The school system or the kids?
Well, in Singapore, it's all pretty much, it's a benevolent dictatorship,
yep,
if you like. So it's really what the
allegedly
government decides.
The best form of government?
Indeed, yes. So incredibly efficient, but you can only go so far in terms of efficiency. So they were concerned about following that Japanese model, which they saw, which was incredible efficiency, but maybe losing out some of that creativity in there.
Yeah.
So the government was starting to say, we want creativity in this process. And I was looking at it and thinking, from a non-academic perspective, how do you actually do this when you've got such a structured process?
Yeah.
So I was really interested in creativity in the creative process. And then I thought, well, where do we do research in this space? And the great thing about the advertising industry, you've got this microcosm of people whose entire job is to be creative.
Yes.
And so that's where I thought this might be a good place to start doing some research.
It's interesting that the copywriters and art directors are actually called creatives, which I don't know how that came about. I think it's because there's so much crossover between the two. In the old days, it was you're a copywriter and art director, but now you're that's creative.
Caused one or two problems with the research because when you write the word creatives, they don't know what you mean in the academic sense.
Yeah. Yes.
But certainly, that diet has been really insightful in terms of trying to understand that process.
Every industry invents its own terms or misuses ordinary terms in order to try and confuse everyone else. What about you, Hugh?
Oh, well, my background, essentially always interested in strategy as a whole and sort of the exploration of strategy. And I guess that really came through in seeing how leaders make decisions under uncertainty where we don't have a set of rules that you're playing with that we need to use. And over time, working from sort of government through corporate and other areas, I kept saying there's something missing in our strategic models and always seemed to be our real purpose and value for being in business. And it seemed to be, well, hang on, if we're trying to make a product that serves a particular group of people, or even a service, if you will. So the service sort of idea, then surely we should put them at the front end of it. And if we do that successfully, the rewards will flow back to our other stakeholders.
Sorry, by them, you mean the strategists?
Consumers.
Consumers.
Right? So from a strategic point of view.
I always forget about them.
That's right. Consumers. So we need that voice consumer. And as I walk through from this sort of high level of facilitation with leaders in our organisations, I keep saying, where are the customers? Where are they? Where is the voice of them? And which part of our organisation do we hear it? And the only place I've found it so far is really in advertising. It's starting to come back more into the marketing organisations. So that's
very interesting from a marketing point of view. That it's the agencies who are considered to have the voice of the consumer. You see it with clients in that they want to sell something and they've manufactured it, or they plan to manufacture it, and too often they don't really allow the consumers into the equation. It's what they want to do rather than what people want to buy, and it's then up to the agency to try and sell that. At which point the agency points out that maybe it's not the right product in the first place.
And we get this sort of reverse now with big data. It seems to really have given marketing managers, if you want, data to legitimise a market, but really it's just giving them a lot of centralisation of their product. They see what the centre really wants and they start making a product directly to that group of people. And because the numbers are there, they can legitimise these decisions. In doing so, though, you're starting to miss a lot of differentiation out of the...
And Henry Ford's famous quote that if I asked consumers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. People don't know what they don't know. I think Apple were very strong at that in creating stuff that people... creating demand for things that they didn't know that they needed.
And I think if you look at the creative process in there, you sort of need to differentiate it a wee bit. You can do the P&G model, which is that incremental change really, really rapidly to move up to something different. And in that case, you might be able to have this consumer following along because they can say, I want it slightly faster, I want it brighter, I want it more colourful, whatever it is. But if you want to do that paradigm shifting, what would turn to big C, and we see the same thing in the advertising, the consumer doesn't have the ability to do that.
Are you familiar with, I think we talked about it in the podcast before, the Maya principle, MAYA, most advanced yet acceptable, that if you go too far with the consumer, you lose them.
And I was wondering, from an advertising perspective, is that just the consumer or is that also the client?
It's funny in that if the agency is the voice of the consumer as far as the client's concerned, the client is the voice of the consumer as far as the agency is concerned, or the client likes to put on that hat. Mm. But if so, it's a very conservative consumer who is hugely aware and hugely in love with that client's products, which, as we know, is not generally the way that the consumer looks.
And quite often that the habit that can be formed, the consumer might have for a product, is not the same necessarily as that love and loyalty of a very select group. There's a lot of other people to be brought into this process.
Yes. Yeah, to increase market share, you have to go wider, and it's not enough to get the small core of people who like your product to buy more of it, because they can't. People can generally only buy one car at a time, or in terms of beer, they can only drink so much beer in a week. You have to widen the market rather than increasing the capacity to consume within a small group of loyalists. And I think marketers constantly exaggerate would do, exaggerate the love that people have for their product.
Again, the consumer's buying a category of which you are hopefully the best option in that mode to fulfill the need of that category.
Yes.
They're not... Ideally, you can take your competition out of the picture by being perfectly differentiated, but as you move to the centre, you become the biggest and most gravitational brand. You then actually start to need to be creating boundaries that keep others out. It has to become aspirational. And this is Apple's success.
Yes.
Is that they can only sell and they can charge a certain value to this select group of people and supply through a set group of suppliers who meet their expectations, and others have to step up to become their consumer.
In a sense, I think with Apple, the Apple consumers worked as the converters. People who consumed Apple so loved and fell in love with the product that they convinced their friends, colleagues, acquaintances that if they weren't buying Apple, they were somehow
inadequate,
lesser people. But they had a fantastic product. The iPhone, I don't think you can overestimate the way that the iPhone has changed culture. When you look back to how life existed before it, and the myriad of possibilities that you can, and that kids now just completely take for granted that yes, they have this. The old folk like me can remember a time when they didn't have one.
I don't throw my Apple products. Other operating systems can sometimes find themselves flying across a room.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I'll duck when that happens. So Mark, you wanted to learn how it was that creatives did their job. When they have a brief that they say that there's a new car, we need to sell as many of it as possible. A very simplistic looking brief. You looked at actually what creatives did.
Yeah, so my premise initially, because I went back like most academics do and looked at the literature. So what has been done in the past in regards to the science behind this? And really most of the models set up a number of stages. And I was quite interested in looking at within those stages, what can we do to improve the creative outputs? And most of the research in creativity looks at one small part of it, and that's the idea generation phase, and that sort of divergent thinking. And there's some really nice stuff around what you need to be a good divergent thinker.
A good what, sorry?
Divergent thinker.
Okay.
So somebody who's able to come up with these highly creative ideas.
Yeah.
And speaking to people, again, at DDB...
So this was a DDB back in 2002-ish?
Yeah, around then.
Yeah.
So obviously chatting with the likes of yourself, I think Peter was one of your creators.
Peter Thompson.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I remember having a wonderful conversation with him. And I walked into the room and talked about how he came up with creative ideas. And he talked about, I've got a campaign he was working on at the time. I think it was some sort of restaurant. It was a cat food campaign. And he says, okay, well, obviously I could do something really boring like have a couple of cats sitting in front of a table and having a menu and talking about what's on there. But obviously that's too blasé, that's too boring. And I thought to myself, you've made a leap here, which most normal people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so there's a level of inherent ability, but there's also, within the literature, you can see there's a level of learning which can occur.
Well, he does that. So Pete at the time had been in advertising for, 25, 30 years maybe. So that was completely instinctive.
Exactly. But what I noticed with a lot of the creatives I spoke to, and not just in Auckland, but in New York and the other agencies I was doing stuff with, is they would all have these techniques which they weren't aware of them, they seem to have internalised them. So one of the others would have a dictionary which they'd go and they'd open up and get a completely random word. Yeah. So they'd have what I refer to as associative techniques. So they'd jump to distant areas to give them some sort of different way of thinking about things. This is very different from the new creatives. So speaking with some of the new creatives,
new as in younger.
Yep, younger people coming in, and they'd be searching the internet and looking for terms, but they'd be looking at more moving out from that central spot. So you have what's in the brief and they'd just build upon that. So they'd move slowly out, that sort of P&G model, so that incremental small developments, where the really experienced creatives would have these internalised structures with a jump.
Yeah.
And they were able to do that. And that takes a different type of mind than is normal. So one of the elements I was looking at is the ability to use these creative thinking techniques, these associative abilities. And we tested that on different groups, the creatives, account people and students, and saw what the effects were. The other area I was interested in is how we actually get locked into a box.
What, as in creative or non-creative?
Yep. So in the literature, we talk about this in terms of what's referred to.
Clubs around Auckland where you can get that done.
Yeah, slightly different type of creative we're talking about there.
Oh, right.
So, it's definitely put me off my train of thought. So, mental set fixation is what they talk about in the literature, whereby if I have too much information in an area, it stops me thinking about different areas. And this is a big problem. Again, if I provide you with a whole lot of information, suddenly we're talking about boxes and clubs and things, that can stop me thinking about a certain way. I can't get away from that chain of thought.
So would an example of that be if you were advertising a car and it was the speed of the windows closing and the weight of the carburettor and the whatever, the individuals would just get overwhelmed.
Exactly. Yeah. And my assumption was you'd give too much information in the brief, that might lock the creatives in. And so we did some testing around that. So we did different associative techniques, we did certain cues which would actually lock people in, and we saw what the effects were. And it was really quite interesting because the creatives weren't locked in because they actually were so good and they had these internalised techniques that they could jump anyway. But for the account people and for the students, they were more locked in by that sort of information and they were less able to actually use those associative abilities, but they were still able to use techniques to actually get them further away from them than they would normally.
Sorry, so Mark, when you say associative abilities, you mean the ability almost instinctively without thought to go from one area to another. Now, and I think an important question which is often asked is creativity inbuilt or is it learned?
And it's a combination. There's, I like always to say with my class, look, I'm not Usain Bolt. I'm only ever going to be so fast. Obviously, I'm incredibly athletic, and the students all laugh, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I can...
No comment.
Yeah, I can get so fast, but I could actually do some training and get a fair bit faster.
Yeah.
So same thing with creative ability. There's a wonderful piece of research back, I think it's 1968, guy called Mednick, who talks about associative hierarchies. And some people have what we refer to as a flat associative hierarchy. So they can associate ideas which other people wouldn't be able to associate. And this is what we sort of did in some of our research. Would say, okay, here's a product category. Let's use this word seagull and then use that to relate to that particular concept. Now, for the students, they just got completely lost. They couldn't do anything. Yeah. For the creatives, they could bring in that and use them. So they had this really flat associative hierarchy. They were able to use all these terms and actually make associations between these ideas which other people wouldn't get anywhere close to.
So is it possible to take a younger person, I don't know, whether it be a child of 10 or a student of 16, and give them a test and work out from that whether or not they were creative?
Well, this would be the, what is the term I'm looking for? This would be the holy grail.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Mednick's test, for example, this guy who came up with associative hierarchy, he developed the remote association test, and you might have seen this. Is we have two terms, and then you've got to have a third term that relates to this. Unfortunately, with that encourages a certain way of thinking, encourages more sort of convergence. There's a right answer. Yeah. There's other tests. Torrance is another researcher who do a lot of work in this space. He would use a paperclip test, for example, and say, give me as many uses as you can for a paperclip.
Yeah, so I believe that in the past, those tests were used by agencies. I think, say, in the 50s and 60s, if you went along and you went, I want to be a copywriter, and they'd go, right, here's a paperclip, give me 50 uses for it.
And the problem with these tests is they don't have any sort of association with long-term creative outputs, because there's all these other factors. You'd be able to tell me all day about all the other things you need to be a successful creative. And again,
I was hoping you'd tell me, but I'm still waiting to find out. Yeah.
One of the things which, obviously the structure within the organisation is important. Again, if we allow creatives to be creative, they're creative. If one of the biggest issues we've found in the research, which is really consistent, is if the client themselves, the organisation that is asking for the idea, isn't willing to explore ideas, the creators pick up on that pretty quickly and they just stop being creative.
Or they limit their creativity and they go, well, it's got to have a pack shot, It's got to have a picture of the product,
Yep.
and it's got to have a line that talks about how wonderful it is, and that's about it.
And
really.
that's an intelligent adaptation to a social situation where they realise there's no control. There's no point in us doing anything beyond what they're being asked for because it's not going to be listened to.
Yes.
And so these social elements come in, and it's not all cognitive. It's not all about being able to think in very flexible and elaborative ways. Those are just one of the competencies that creative people need to have.
Yeah, having worked with car manufacturers in the past, the starting point is, if you're doing a billboard, the starting point is it is a big picture of a car. Now, to creatives, it is the least creative thing that you could do, because 95% of car billboards have a large picture of the car on it.
I think this is where we start to get into some of where my research works in, which is how we then use the information. And we find that creators will set the information aside if it's not appropriate. And others will look at it and go, well, why is that information not being presented? Where's the message that we asked you to get through? Because we're making a mistake between the message that communicates with the consumer in the voice that the consumer can understand and take it in at the level that they do to achieve that level of awareness or other objective that the marketer wants, and the message the marketer wants to see represented across that. They don't understand that they can come through in it may be presented in quite a different way.
Maybe that the client has what he wants to say, the consumer has what he wants to hear, and the creatives can translate between the two and make the client what the client wants to say, what the consumer wants to hear.
Exactly, which may not look the way that the client envisaged, especially if they then step back into a rational processing model.
I think it's very difficult for clients because they live and breathe, and they have to, that old saying that it's impossible to convince someone of something that their livelihood depends on them not believing, in that clients intrinsically believe or are indoctrinated that their product is fantastic, and the consumer might not always share that belief. And for the client, we just have a wonderful picture of my new yogurt, and people will see how, and just say delicious, and you're off. And consumers don't work like that.
John Hegarty was saying that, I think, on your podcast the other week, wasn't it? That he's going, well, make a better product.
Yes.
That suits your customers, not trying to sell them this one that doesn't get there.
Yeah.
But I would add there's another key element of creativity, and this element is often, I think, also under emphasised in the academic research, and that's the capturing of attention, the originality component.
Yes.
So if you know a product very well, I don't need to capture your attention. I don't need to draw you to it. And a lot of the creatives in the early research would say, okay, look, it has to be more divergent. It has to be more out there because it has to grab attention. But the stuff we do in the academic research often uses what we refer to as forced exposure. We get people, we sit them down in front of the ad and we say, look at this, okay, what was important, what do you remember? Now, that's not the reality. So for the client, they know their product really well. They've already got that embedded knowledge. I don't have to, therefore, draw their attention to it. For a consumer, I've got to hit them over the head just to get them to look at anything. So the originality component, I think, is more important, and I think the creatives realise that, whereas the client might have trouble realising that.
I think that the media budgets come into play a lot there. And if you've got a large amount of money, and you are, say, Coca-Cola, if you emblazon the world with billboards outside every dairy that say enjoy Coca-Cola, and nothing of any interest, then that kind of ekes its way into the blood of the consumer, and it's like, I know there's a robotic response to that, but people don't generally have Coca-Cola's budgets, and if you're launching a little soft drink and they try and advertise in the same way, it's not going to work.
Well, if you look at the effect, unfortunately, of advertising in the academic literature, it's minimal. But what we do see, if you do really creative stuff, it has a massive effect. And as we know, you'll have seen this in your career, those really, really creative ads can change industries.
Yep.
So they can have this...
Not always mine, but other people's,
So they can have these massive impacts because they get it right.
So, sorry, I just going back there, for academic literature, says that advertising often doesn't work?
It doesn't.
That's a big statement.
Well, I wouldn't say it doesn't work. I mean, there is, depending upon what you're trying to measure. If you're looking at those are sales effects, but of course you can be looking at parts of the process further up. And again, what's the advertising as part of a broader campaign trying to achieve? So the advertising might be more about that early stage cognition, the awareness, the initial attitude change, whereas other elements, they might bring in the sales promotions, events and other things in store, the merchandising to actually drive the sales. So advertising effect on sales, again, some works, some doesn't, but the overall elasticities, across elasticities, the demand elasticities of using advertising itself aren't all that spectacular.
I guess it depends. It depends on a lot of factors.
Yes.
It depends on the ad, and of course, as John Haggerty would say, it depends on the product. And as Bill Bernbach would say, nothing kills a bad product faster than advertising.
Well, the other thing you've got is, again, like Coca-Cola, you really can't see the true effect of advertising in a lot of the research because you've got a baseline which is already quite high.
Yeah.
And nobody's willing to stop all their advertising, and you're not going to stop everybody advertising in a particular industry just to see what the effects are. So what you might be doing with advertising is just maintaining your existing market share. And for mature markets, therefore, you wouldn't see much of effect unless you actually stopped advertising.
Yeah.
Yes, the sort of changes in demand we see through advertising aren't that strong, but doesn't mean that it isn't actually having an effect on awareness, attitude change and sales.
Yeah.
But what we do see is if it's the highly creative stuff, it can have quite a dramatic effect.
But how do you judge? This is always difficult. How do you judge what is the highly creative stuff and what is not?
And there's a whole lot of different measures used in the academic literature. And a lot of them use proxy measures. So they'll go and they'll look at the award shows and see who won the Effie or all of those awards and use that as the basis. Some will actually go and use the students who are participating in the actual data collection and do some testing of them, some pre-testing of those ads to see how creative they are. So there's a lot of different ways which the measurement is actually done.
Quite often, or at least on occasion, an advertising campaign will come out, and the automatic reaction of consumers to it is one of rejection. No, that's completely wrong. But it's made a impression on them, and over time that gets reversed to actually, I love that. That thing that first shocked me the first time I saw it.
Totally agree, and that is also a problem because you've really got to think about how often you're collecting that data to see what those effects are. And often, again, it's just one point in time where we're actually able to collect that data. So, more longitudinal studies, more studies over a long period of time is certainly needed.
Yeah. So, creatives in themselves, how do they, or people who are creative, how do they differ from the general population, if at all?
Well, again, I think they do have this flatter associative hierarchy. I think they take in more information all of the time.
That's how they work.
Yep.
But how would you outwardly? Do they dress differently? Do they?
Well, actually, that's one of the studies that has been done on Hollywood. Creators, for example, says that they have to adopt the uniform. Essentially, these writers over time get into the black T-shirt and the jeans and whatever starts to look like the creative should, in order to pitch their work to the people with the money.
Yeah.
If to look like a creative. For the creative themselves, I'm sure that's a fairly unnecessary aspect because they're used to expressing themselves as they are.
And it's probably the conformity. We use, one of the problems with evaluating highly creative ideas is it's difficult. Because if you're making this connection between two really unusual ideas, you've done that based upon your own knowledge. You might have gone out and collected data on what the client wants to find out. You've done your own research. So you've embedded some knowledge, and then you make this connection between two unusual thoughts. You can see how they're connected because you've got the knowledge of those two unusual memory categories. Somebody else who doesn't have that same memory, so that same knowledge, will have problems doing that evaluation. Yeah. So we often, when we're looking at creatives, we use sort of rules of thumb. So they look outlandish, they act unusual, therefore they're creative people, therefore we're more likely to accept those unusual ideas for them. So probably this is, and one of the things, again, back to what creatives have to do within agencies, I mean, one of the big things which creatives were saying to me again and again and again is half our job is a selling job.
Right. How do they get better at that? Because we're presuming that selling their creative or male work is a good idea. We're not trying to bludgeon clients into buying things that are going to ruin their business. If we accept that creative thoughts and advertising is going to do a better job for the client, yet there can be a certain drawing back from that because it's a little bit scary and not a connection that they would easily make. How would you advise creatives to go about I think selling their work?
How they do it is reluctantly often. And it's the same thing. We have the same issue in academia. I mean, we're not necessarily seen as highly creative, but we have to come up, I mean, our job is really to develop new ideas. Yeah. And we have to go through that same sort of process of selling it. So we have to identify, okay, what are those appropriateness criteria which the people are going to use? What is the processes that we're going to go through? Therefore, how do we structure the work we do? So that we can see the same thing with the creatives. They've really got to understand what the client wants and sometimes just window dress it to actually get the idea across and swallow a big pill sometimes.
You see that when you have a client that the creators are actually able to be in the meeting with at the early stages, and when it's a very generative meeting where expectations are set and brief is, say, co-created, then at the same point you can get what are the performance measures, how will we be evaluated on this, and whether those measures are based on the outcome more, or is it the output? You need 4 ads out of this. Right, that's quite a different perspective as well. The
physical,
the physical output. So if it's a physical output measure, you're focused on the wrong answer to your business problem, and that's quite a different way of framing it. So you're in the room and you can get the understanding together of a generative process rather than a competitive process, then that's a safe environment for the creators because there's an opportunity to explore both a personal dynamic and the category dynamic, the business problem itself. And this is where I guess the best creative directors come across because they now know how to balance that skill over time of managing the client relationship as well as the creative outcome.
So with the client, I think in the old days, the thought was that, say, if you had a new campaign to present to a client, you'd have a meeting and you'd go through the meeting and you'd lead up and talk through their strategy and whatever, and then there would be a big reveal and the lights would go down and it would be ta-da, and there'll be a hedgehog with pineapple on its head or something, and and the client would go, oh my god, what the hell is that about? But it's the old lobster in the pot of boiling water. If you just turn it up, so you have the client involved in the process all the way through, so you're taking away the shock. You introduce him to the hedgehog and you introduce him to the pineapple, and it will get friendly over a period of weeks, and so at the end the hedgehog with a pineapple on his head is completely
that's right,
normal.
And ideally the best client would be able to come and have this early meeting, and then I think this is probably Mike Watson, step away from the majority of that to allow the space. Coming back in at the process points where you need that. So they come on the journey with you, understanding fully what the outcome will achieve, and that may be quite different from what they envisaged. I mean, that's why you've hired an agency, is to do something that you don't have the capability inside currently to do, whether it's because of time or cognitive space to actually sit down and think through the strategy and how to best approach it.
I think that phrase, the outcome is not what you envisaged, is really important, and I think for a client that is potentially moment and needs a bit of thinking. Whereas for a creative director, you've kind of been working. Say you have a couple of teams working on a brief, and you've been thinking about it vaguely in mind, and the teams come in for review. And when a team presents something that goes beyond what you'd expected, that's when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and you go, right, okay. And that is generally a completely opposite reaction to a client. For a creative director, it's excitement, and for a client, it's fear.
And really, this is where the creative directors are such a pivotal and important role, because those boundary spanners, understanding the client, what they'll accept, being able to push the client to actually go further than they normally would, and also protect the creative and allow them to be creative.
Yeah.
Because creatives in organisations, they want to be developing weird and wonderful ideas. They want to be doing these divergent connections, but that process itself takes a lot of cognitive effort.
You did ask you about what the creative can be, and Csikszentmihalyi, one of the researchers of flow. You might have heard of the flow theory.
I'll pretend to say yes,
pretend.
but no.
Okay, so if you can say his name, it's this great big long name, Csikszentmihalyi, and he talks about the creative personality as encapsulating most of what, say, Jung would call the mature personality in its whole. And despite all the immature behaviours you might see coming out of it, it's one that can embrace all of those dimensions of humanity that may be in play in that moment when they're thinking it through. And probably for an early creative who can be very frustrated by the client's inability to see the value of their ideas. They've had this insight, and it's a connection at such an intense level that they then need to express it. This is how it's going to hit. And so that can create a lot of conflict within the individual. And so a very good creative director has probably overcome that and learns, okay, that's all right, I can have more ideas. They're not going to accept that. We can step away from it. Where maybe a younger or junior hasn't had that maturity level to do so yet.
To me, two different ways of creativity that come about, and one is the if you have a problem, to keep going back to it, to keep actually trying to solve it and to push it and to go back and back again and make these connections, and it's quite painful. I think people outside the industry laugh at creatives going, "Fuck, it's hard work doing that," and they go, "Well, I'm digging a ditch or doing whatever," and you're sitting there trying to think out of things, but it's mentally draining. The other one is that you can, that I as a writer, and maybe as an art director, you do it physically, you would draw it. As a writer, I can start writing something, and I've no idea where it's going to go. Authors can go. So some authors like plan it out, and we got we got 14 chapters, and these are all the points we have to hit. And other people sit down and go, right, two people meet, and it just goes off. For me, that is a magic part of creativity, when even as the creator you have absolutely no idea the next word that is going to come out of your pen, and it just hits there. What is the cognitive process that causes that? So there's an easy question.
Two starting points. As seen in sort of research around drugs, for example, is if you start from this convergent point of view, again, where you have a set sort of, again, frame that you're writing into, then your search stays within that parameters. You never really do it. Whereas from a divergent point of view, is you go, okay, we have a problem to be solved, and you go on that journey, and that is the first part of the process towards greater ideas, which then you need to then narrow back down to what's appropriate once you can see the direction of it. The divergent, this is Mark's research as a whole, it comes out and says that's the important way. If you start convergent, you just don't spread it. wide enough in terms of its originality to.
But I think that blinkers are actually really useful because they stop you being completely irrelevant. And
yes, because again, a high intake of knowledge. Well, which one is the area we're going to filter?
To me, the worst brief is do an ad. Now,
Right.
I often juniors or students will go, "Oh, this brief is so constrictive. It's I have to do a billboard that says what's it." But to me, I hate it's do an ad, and you can do absolutely anything. You need to have blinkers to
Yes.
give you some idea of the way that you're going.
Yeah, and this again, it was interesting looking at. I remember going to. There was a New Yorker creative who I'd been speaking to at an agency, and he was doing some classes for up and coming, and he's kept on saying in the classes to these kids essentially, be divergent, be divergent, be divergent. I want new ideas, I want different ideas. But then his entire evaluation of those ideas they came up with was around the appropriateness criteria. And it was the same thing, I think, even. And you'll tell me if I'm wrong.
But was he critical about them when and he go, right, I've got to judge it, and you go, well, that's got nothing at all to do with the issue, and then they go, but you told me to.
Exactly, yeah. But then he always came back to the appropriateness.
So we see this in copy testing was one of the areas that so I looked at.
Copy testing,
pre-testing, or post-testing, those things. Now, creatives know and expect that it's going to happen on particular accounts. But the nature of what's being measured becomes very important. And what we found is that you can actually get a lot more originality through copy testing on those measures when they're looking at, those outcome performance areas, because it just provides this frame of what it has to hit as a whole to keep the creative somewhat restrained, but still allows that freedom. But if those copy testing measures are used to sort of evaluate the performance of the creative, rather than the campaign, if that makes sense.
Okay, no, I'm lost there. So what? How well it resonates with the consumer?
Yes, so that can be a good thing. So when you're trying to make that's the point, rather than how well an ad works. So copy testing creates a frame. If it's used as performance measure on the creative, on them personally, if it starts to feel that way about it, then it does become restricting because it feels like you don't trust me to do my job. And the focus then shifts again in the mind to the wrong
in the mind of the creative.
Yes, to the wrong. You've lost your purpose in trying to reach that consumer. You're starting to then make that ad rather than the bigger frame. So, it becomes an information itself about the political environment, not necessarily about the outcome hitting that target.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I would interpret that in a slightly different way. If some of these sort of particularly post-test measures are fine because I can actually fit in the little brand elements and all those aspects which then will hit and meet those criteria. And so therefore I feel I can be highly creative and just add that sort of window dressing around the edges at the end just to pass the test.
Right, okay. So you're advertising your yogurt again. It can be set in a on Mars with a bunch of aliens playing rugby, but then as long as you have a pack shot and a line at the end that says eat sunshine yogurts, they're great.
Yep, you're going to pass the test, exactly. Yeah. And the tests are, we all know tests are problematic.
Yes. We talked about Henry Ford and his research before. The idea of getting a group of people together in a room and sitting them down, the idea that they will tell you the truth, what they actually feel, as opposed to what they think that other people, that will make them look good to other people in the room, is very unlikely. And people, when you see ads, you generally see it more than once. The first time you see it, you might, as a consumer, might go, "What?" And the second time you go, "Ah." If you're researching with consumers, they see it once, and the reaction, "Huh?" And Repeat viewing is generally built into the process and really important. Yet you're only ever tested on seeing it once.
Yeah, and it is a problem. And what you talked about earlier in regards to, again, you've got the Coca-Cola, you've got the media everywhere, you've got the huge budgets, and yet that need to actually grab the consumer if you're a small company, break through all that clutter, that requires that much more divergent original stuff. And that, again, is the stuff that has the breakthrough. So I always say to my classes, hey, you can do two things. You can spend a huge amount on the media, or you can do something really creative. Now, which is easier?
Yeah.
But actually being highly creative isn't easy, as you said. I mean, if you're sitting down and you're writing a book and you're going out randomly, if you're somebody who has a really, what we call, again, back to the dissociative hierarchy, the steep dissociative hierarchy, you can't connect different ideas together, you're not going to go anywhere with that.
No.
But if you've got a flat dissociative hierarchy, you can connect lots of different ideas and you're bringing in all these different thoughts because that's the way your mind works. You're going to come up with something weird and wonderful. So, and there's only so much we can train that. We can improve it. We've all had creativity classes, and you move people from being let's say a C to a B.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily move them into an A.
Yeah, there was a theory that I heard that that everyone was creative, and the only difference was that creative people thought they were creative, like someone had.
Yep, and I disagree with that entirely.
That's good.
Good. No, I think, again, there are people with much flatter associative hierarchies.
Yeah.
I mean, they just jump all over the place, and sometimes it's hard to follow them.
Yeah.
This guy, for example.
Yeah.
Sometimes jumps around and incredibly creative. Will jump from idea to idea, and that's great. But sometimes, of course, you lose people because they can't follow that.
Yeah.
They can't follow those leaps.
Up the Congo with Kurtz.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it's good to have a sort of definitive point of view on that. And I guess this is something for parents to look out for in kids, just because a kid isn't necessarily capable of making those creative leaps doesn't mean he's a bad person. It just means that maybe there's other areas to go into, which is like 98% of jobs.
Yeah. And we can be creative, again, two ways. We can do small incremental steps and move out to that distant area. Yeah. So again, what we're doing with creative is we're combining two different areas. And we can either make that big leap, which is really tough, and once we've made that big leap, nobody else can see that idea. It's just too big. And those two ideas aren't connected. Or we can slowly move out from that starting point. And if we do that really fast, we might get to that big leap, but it might take us a very long period of time. But then we'll have all the little incremental steps people can follow.
So I've got in trouble by suggesting that it's very useful for planners, for strategists in agencies. So for creative to make the big associative leap from yogurt to a restaurant on Mars, say, for the planner to justify why that cognitive leap makes sense and give it some kind of logical form, so that client go, oh, of course, that's how natural. We've got a restaurant on Mars. That someone else can come in and justify why it's being done, because a brief says we're at A, we want to get to B, and there's a road between it. And A being we have this product, and B being we want the consumer to go, oh, I like the look of that product. That sounds quite interesting. And the brief lays out a roadmap to get there. What creatives can do, go, well, I don't like, no, that roadmap's fine, but why don't we take a helicopter and we can go around that way, and we end up in the same place. And I've seen strategists or planners go, oh, but you haven't followed my roadmap. To which my point, well, it doesn't matter. You're going to get to the same place, and it's more interesting. Can you help justify that or explain that to a client, how a leap of faith can actually put you in a better place? And
I hate to say it, I think that's a large part of what their role should be, and they should accept that that's their role.
Yeah.
Because you want the creators to be creatives. You want them to come up with something which is a bit different, because that's really important in that consumer process. And the client might lose, as you said, that focus on that that need for that part of the process.
The plan then has to become the voice of rationality in that conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things in one of the more recent pieces of research is looking at the problem with the valuation of creative ideas.
Yes.
Because this is obviously a huge issue for the industry, but academia hasn't looked at it pretty much at all. And again, what we're finding is if you are having these really divergent ideas, other people can't see it in terms of the appropriateness. You can see an idea as original. If I connect marketing with rocket science, somehow connect those two ideas, people say, okay, well, it's different, it's unusual. But it's very hard for anybody else to see how those ideas actually work, how appropriate they are. So this is really the big problem. How do you actually get the clients to actually see that idea, that this what comes across as a wacky idea is actually appropriate for them, actually makes sense for them? And that can take a lot of time and a lot of effort.
It's difficult because the client's job depends on the success of it, and the client has to go back to the rest of his client colleagues within the organisation, sales, up to C-suite, and go, I've got this wacky idea. I really think it could, there might be something in it, and he has to take all those with him, and that's difficult.
The classic case, of course, is the Dove campaign for beauty, which was exactly this. The market research was coming back saying, look, women are no longer associating with these waif-thin models, for example. It's not their real shape, and it's starting to, instead of being aspirational, it's starting to be a negative judgment on themselves. So we need to start showing them, and to do so, I think it was inside of a planner who then said, all right, well, we need to do something different to get through to this male industry, that this is not how females see themselves. And they did that by then filming or basically doing ethnography with the daughters of the male industry who could now, and putting that in front of it. So that in itself, a creative act for selling into the client.
But that originally, I think, was done in one market. I think it started in Canada. So it didn't go to Dove headquarters in somewhere in the States and go, hey, we've got this massive global campaign. No, they're somewhere on the periphery, and change happens on the periphery. Canada comes up with this idea, and then everyone else looked at it, went, oh, that's interesting, and built it into their global marketing.
And this is again in the research, and this will be no surprise to you whatsoever. The companies who are more creative in terms of their advertising are those ones who are having problems with their brand. Their sales are going down, they're having issues, or they're new companies who actually need to break through. So it's that risk propensity, if you like, of that client. Because creativity is risk. It's moving away. If you're a strong existing brand and everybody has got this embedded knowledge as a consumer about what you're currently doing, and now you're saying you're going to do something different, that's really...
But I would say... I would say, and I have some evidence to support this, that it isn't risk. And risk is a word that I dislike using in the agency. I've heard members of the agency tried to sell work into clients by going, I know it's risky, but it could really be great. It isn't risky. Doing the same as everyone else is doing, that's the risky bit.
And I agree with you entirely. It's their perception of risk, though. For them, it's risky.
The clients have a tendency to look at the resource deficiency they have and turn it into a sort of dyad, a continuum between risk or not risk. Right. And for an agency, it's, well, no, actually, there's all these other elements that exist, and if you can twist into that element, then you get that new position that will pay off.
I think it's not just that to be ordinary is risky. It's that consumers, if you've been, there's a great feeling amongst clients that, well, this product's been around for 80 years and sales have been consistently good over that time. And they've kind of fallen into a bit of a doldrum now. If we do this campaign that repositions it and has great cut through and everybody notices and the potentially some negative reaction to it, but potentially some really positive reaction to it. We can't do that because everyone will stop buying the product. I don't accept that, and my experience does not bear that out. People don't suddenly go, well, I've seen that ad, for this beer that I've been drinking for 20 years. No, I don't really like the ad, so I'm going to stop drinking the beer. That doesn't happen.
Unless it's really, really bad as an ad.
I think that people are creatures of habit.
I agree. I mean, there's the...
It'll be a real challenge to do one that bad, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, I use in my 100 level class, I showed the old... Do you remember back when was it? It would have been 80s, Gillette, the best a man can get campaign.
I think, yeah.
And that was a motive. It was really powerful. I mean, there was back in the days when I was starting to shave, I looked at that, and that actually brought me in as a consumer. It was probably the first time I thought about this type of product. Used all these years. Then you got this new campaign coming through. And this campaign obviously... in America, it had a backlash.
Right.
Yep. So it was the best the man can be, and had some connotations that obviously men. It showed men whistling at a woman walking down the street, doing derogatory stuff, letting the kids beat each other up, and saying, "Hey, actually, we can do better than that."
Yes. I remember.
And it had a lot of backlash in that American market. It obviously came out.
Well, there's backlash, and there's people going, oh my God, I don't like that. And there's also, I don't like that ad, so I'm going to stop buying this razor that I bought.
Yep, indeed. And so I said to the class exactly what you're saying. For me, again, I've used Gillette for all this year. I'm just going to keep on using it. I really like the initial ad. This one, I'm not so. I'm not so fussed with it, but that was really trying to expand their market share. It's probably looking at that female market with the razors and things.
I'm sure it was looking at Dove and going, we need to do, and this happens. Clients will look at it and go, oh, that's made a real. We need to do the equivalent for.
Yep. So
now, one of our colleagues' research was along these lines, and so she looked at products that were predominantly masculine, and that they could be taken and sold into a female market, spread in that way. It doesn't work as well the other way around.
Men buying female products, no.
No, regardless of what you do. There's sort of this directional flow from masculine idea to feminine idea, and the other one is much slower.
Yeah, and you can look at the reasons to that. Beer, for example, you can have a beer, and women will look at the ad and go aimed at men, and it'd be quite blokey, and women will look at that. Yeah, it's perfectly acceptable to drink that beer. If you have a beer ad aimed at women, men will not touch it.
Exactly. I think Nike is another interesting case with the Colin Kaepernick situation. Yes. Of course, when that emerged, making a very, very deliberate statement of actually we're going to take this value and adopt it, in which case there is a lot of outrage and protest from a particular segment who went out and burnt their Nikes. That's great. They can say, hey, it's time for us to move from your consumer values to these values. And, if you're not part of that, you can leave and be public in leaving. We create, again, that differentiation with our brand to increase value.
Yeah, I think when you have, I don't know, there's maybe 5 major sportwear brands, and as a consumer, you go in and of which Nike was probably the leading one. You go in and there's, if you go, you're either with Nike or you're against Nike, you've reduced it to 2. And therefore that should help sales. I don't actually know what the sales result was from the Kaepernick campaign, which I support.
Initially, they had a bit of a dip, but it took off.
The stock market changed a little bit as
no, there wasn't immediate
people who buy stocks just changed their position on it more than anything. But there wasn't an immediate effect, but certainly within about a month, their sales had rocketed up.
Yeah. So again, you're right. I mean, a lot of those existing consumers won't change their behaviour, and maybe we're just targeting that new market and expanding out. So that's where we've got to be creative.
I think this is something that maybe Trump did in his election, and it became when he was running for the nomination from the Republican Party, when there's 8 different candidates. He went so much out on a limb. So instead of Trump being one of 8, it was for Trump or against Trump. So you then have 50-50. And we know how that one went.
I'm not a big fan of Nike's current work. I don't find that creative at all. Yes, it's very interesting that they have...
But the editing of the...
Yeah, that's interesting from a technique basis, and a lot of work that went into it. But as far as some messages that they communicated, it's very much begging for relevance. And I don't think it sticks with their brand particularly at all.
I saw a lot of it on Twitter. It's my social media of choice, but it was wow, look at the editing on this.
And it's a short-term burn. At best. It doesn't do anything to help build the brand.
Yeah. Okay. Nike, pay attention.
You've been listening to Truth
And Soul.
the New Zealand Advertising Podcast.
End of part 1.